The wealthy mother abandoned her daughter for marrying a black man, but on her deathbed she begged for forgiveness. The ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton sparkled with the light of hundreds of crystals hanging from the immense chandeliers. The cream of Chicago society was gathered for yet another charity gala, a sea of impeccable gowns and tuxedos. In the center of this whirlwind of glamour and pretension, Tasha Bennett felt suffocated. She discreetly adjusted the neckline of her emerald green dress, an exclusive model that hugged her curves with elegance. Her brown eyes scanned the room, looking for an escape route, but found only the stern gaze of her mother, Margaret. Margaret Bennett was the embodiment of Chicago high society. Her grey hair was impeccably groomed, and her classic black dress screamed old money to anyone who dared look. She made a subtle gesture with her head, indicating to Tasha to come closer. With a resigned sigh, Tasha walked towards her mother, her high heels echoing softly on the marble floor. "Tasha, dear," Margaret whispered with a forced smile, "young Worthington is asking for you. It would be nice if you could go and say hello." Tasha felt her stomach turn. Alexander Worthington III was the most sought-after bachelor in Chicago, heir to a fortune in real estate, and every high society mother's dream for her daughters. For Tasha, he was nothing more than a constant reminder of the suffocating expectations her family placed on her. "Mom, please," Tasha begged softly. "Not tonight." Margaret's smile faltered for a moment, her eyes hardening. "Tasha, you're already 28. It's time to think about your future and the future of the Bennett family. Alexander is a great match and—" Margaret's words were interrupted by the first chords of a soft melody. Tasha's eyes were automatically drawn to the small stage set up in the corner of the hall. There, sitting on a stool with a guitar in his lap, was David. David Johnson was a vision apart from the sea of expensive suits and designer dresses. His simple but well-cut suit contrasted with his dark ebony skin. His nimble fingers strummed the guitar strings with a grace that made Tasha's heart race. "Mom, excuse me," Tasha murmured, turning away before Margaret could protest. She walked slowly towards the stage, her eyes fixed on David. When he saw her approaching, a smile lit up his face, making his eyes sparkle. Tasha felt as if the rest of the world disappeared, leaving only her and David in that bubble of music and emotion. David ended the song with a soft flourish, and the hall erupted in polite applause. He bowed briefly before stepping down from the stage, walking directly towards Tasha. "Hey, you," he said softly, taking her hand and placing a gentle kiss on her fingers. Tasha felt a shiver run down her spine. "You looked amazing up there," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. David smiled, a glimmer of pride in his eyes. "Thank you, but I'm sure I'm nowhere near the most incredible sight in this hall tonight." Tasha blushed, feeling the heat creep up her neck. Even after months of secret meetings and stolen moments, David still had the power to make her feel like a schoolgirl in love. "Tasha," David said, his voice suddenly serious, "we need to talk." Tasha's heart leapt. She nodded silently, allowing David to guide her to a quieter corner of the room, away from prying eyes and listening ears. "What is it?" she asked, anxiety growing in her chest. David took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on hers. "I can't take it anymore, Tasha. These secret meetings, these stolen moments, it's not enough. I want more. I want you, completely." Tasha felt her heart racing. "David, you know it's not that simple. My family, society." "To hell with society," David exclaimed quietly but fervently. "Tasha, I love you, and I know you love me too. Isn't it time we stopped hiding?" David's words hung in the air between them, full of promise and danger. Tasha closed her eyes, letting the reality of her situation hit her full force. On one side was her family. The Bennetts were an institution in Chicago, a lineage that went back to the earliest days of the city. Generations of expectations, traditions, and prejudices weighed heavily on Tasha's shoulders. Her mother, Margaret, was the staunch guardian of this legacy, determined to see her only daughter follow in the predetermined footsteps of a society lady. On the other side was David. The son of Jamaican immigrants, David had earned his place in the music world through sheer talent and determination. He represented everything Tasha secretly craved: freedom, passion, authenticity. In David's arms, Tasha felt truly herself, free from the shackles of social expectations. "David," Tasha whispered, opening her eyes to meet his anxious gaze, "do you realize what you're asking of me?" David nodded solemnly. "I know, Tasha. Believe me, I understand the weight of your decision, but I also know that what we have is rare, it's precious, it's worth fighting for." Tasha felt tears forming in the corner of her eyes. She looked over her shoulder, seeing her mother chatting animatedly with the Worthingtons. The image was a painful reminder of the world she belonged to, the world that expected her to conform. "I'm afraid, David," she admitted, her voice trembling. "Afraid of losing everything. Afraid of letting my family down. Afraid of not being strong enough to face the consequences." David took her hands between his touch gentle but firm. "Tasha, look at me," he asked softly. When their gazes met, he continued, "You're the strongest woman I know. You face the pressures of this world every day with grace and dignity. I know you have the strength for it too." David's words ignited a spark of courage in Tasha's chest. She thought of all the times she had bowed to her mother's expectations, all the times she had stifled her true desires in the name of tradition and decorum. And then she thought of the pure joy she felt when she was with David, the sense of freedom and authenticity he brought to her life. "What if," she began hesitantly, "what if we say yes? If we decide to face all this together?" David's face lit up with a radiant smile. "Then, my love, we will begin the greatest adventure of our lives. Together." At that moment, surrounded by the hustle and bustle of Chicago high society, Tasha and David sealed their commitment with a kiss that was discreet but full of promise. It was a kiss that defied convention, that declared war on entrenched prejudices, that proclaimed a love stronger than social barriers. When they parted, Tasha saw her mother approaching out of the corner of her eye, her face a mask of barely concealed disapproval. But for the first time in her life, Tasha didn't feel fear or shame. On the contrary, she felt a wave of determination run through her body. "I'm ready," she said to David, squeezing his hand. And so, hand in hand, Tasha and David turned to face Margaret Bennett and, with her, the full weight of the social expectations that had defined Tasha's life for so long. The road ahead would be difficult, full of obstacles and challenges, but Tasha knew, deep in her heart, that she had made the right decision. The decision to choose love over convention, authenticity over appearances, freedom over stifling traditions. The decision to finally be truly herself. The morning sun filtered through the silk curtains of Tasha's bedroom, casting dancing shadows over David's sleeping face. Tasha watched her husband, amazed at the peace that emanated from him, a stark contrast to the maelstrom of emotions she felt bubbling up in her chest. 3 months had passed since that fateful night at the Ritz-Carlton. 3 months since Tasha had decided to defy the expectations of her family and society to follow her heart. 3 months of joy, love, and consequences. The phone on the bedside table vibrated, startling Tasha. It was a message from her assistant, reminding her of the investor meeting at 10 a.m. Tasha sighed, feeling the weight of her responsibilities piling up on her shoulders. Carefully, so as not to wake David, she got out of bed and headed for the closet. Her fingers wandered along the hangers, past designer dresses and expensive suits, until they reached a more modest section, full of pieces she had recently bought, pieces that reflected her new reality. As she dressed, Tasha couldn't help but let her mind wander back to the events that had followed her wedding to David. The reaction of her mother, Margaret, had been exactly as she had feared, cold, sharp, and unforgiving. "You've made your choice, Tasha," Margaret had said, her voice shaking with restrained anger. They were in the study of the Bennett mansion, the place where so many important family decisions had been made over the generations. "Now you'll have to live with the consequences." Tasha felt her heart squeeze, but held her head high. "Mum, please. David is a good, talented man. If you'd just give him a chance." "Chance?" Margaret interrupted, her voice rising an octave. "You've thrown away generations of tradition, of respect. You've shamed this family in front of the whole of Chicago society. And for what? For a musician?" The contempt in his voice was palpable. "I love him, Mom," Tasha replied, feeling tears forming in her eyes, but refusing to let them fall. "Doesn't that mean anything to you?" For a brief moment, Tasha saw something flicker in her mother's eyes. Pain, regret. But just as it came, it was gone, replaced by the cold mask of disapproval that Margaret had perfected over the years. "Love?" Margaret laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. "Love doesn't pay the bills, Tasha. Love doesn't maintain the respect of society. Love doesn't preserve the legacy of generations." She turned, walking over to the large window overlooking the estate's immaculate gardens. For a moment she was silent, observing the world outside. When she spoke again, her voice was low, almost a whisper. "You are no longer welcome in this house, Tasha. Your credit cards will be cancelled, your allowance suspended. The trust fund your father left you, did consider it frozen." Tasha felt as if the air had been knocked out of her lungs. She knew there would be consequences, but this was beyond her worst expectations. "Mom, you can't do this," she protested, her voice breaking. Margaret turned slowly, her eyes meeting Tasha's. There was no warmth in them, only resolution. There was no warmth in them, only cold, implacable resolve. "I can, and I have. You've made your choice, Tasha. Now live with it." The sound of running water in the bathroom brought Tasha back to the present. She blinked away the painful memories and finished getting ready. David emerged from the bathroom in a cloud of steam, a towel wrapped around his waist. His smile was radiant at the sight of Tasha, but quickly turned into an expression of concern when he noticed the shadow in her eyes. "Hey, is everything all right?" he asked softly, approaching her. Tasha forced a smile. "Yeah, just thinking about today's meeting, it's important." David nodded, understanding. He knew how hard Tasha was working to keep her company afloat, especially now that she could no longer count on her family's financial support. "You'll do fine," he assured her, planting a soft kiss on her forehead. "You're brilliant, Tasha. They'd be crazy not to invest in you." Tasha felt a warmth spread through her chest. This was the David she loved, always supporting her, always believing in her. She allowed herself to relax in his arms for a moment, absorbing his strength and confidence. "Thank you," she murmured against his chest. "I don't know what I'd do without you." David laughed softly. "I'd probably be having tea with the cream of Chicago society and planning yet another boring charity event." Tasha laughed, giving his arm a playful pat. "Hey, some of those events were fun." "Sure, if you like small talk and warm champagne," David teased, his eyes twinkling with amusement. For a moment they stood there, laughing and teasing each other, and Tasha felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. Yes, she had lost a lot by choosing David, but what she had gained was priceless. The moment was interrupted by the insistent ringing of Tasha's phone. She sighed, reluctantly pulling away from David's arms. "I have to go," she said, picking up her bag. "Lunch later?" David nodded. "Of course. I'll be at the studio until 2. Meet you at the cafe around the corner." "Perfect," Tasha smiled, giving him one last kiss before leaving. As she walked down the stairs of the small apartment she now called home, Tasha felt a mixture of emotions, longing for her old life, for the comfort and security it provided, but also a growing sense of pride and accomplishment. She was building something on her own, without the Bennett name or influence to open doors. It was scary, yes, but also incredibly liberating. Stepping out onto the busy street, Tasha held her head high, determined. The day would be challenging, but she was ready to prove her worth, to show the world and herself that she had made the right choice. The price of freedom was high, but Tasha was discovering that it was worth every penny. The meeting with the investors was tense, to say the least. Tasha could feel the curious looks, the slightly raised eyebrows as she entered the conference room. She knew what they were thinking. There was Tasha Bennett, or rather Tasha Johnson now, the girl who had everything and threw it all away for a musician. But Tasha didn't let that get to her. With a confidence that surprised even herself, she gave her presentation, outlining her vision for expanding her digital marketing consultancy company. Her numbers were solid, her strategy well thought out, and most importantly, her passion was evident. When she finished, there was a moment of silence in the room. Then, slowly, one of the investors, an older man with grey hair and piercing eyes, leaned forward. "Impressive, Ms. Johnson," he said, a slight smile playing on his lips. "I must admit, when I heard that Tasha Bennett was looking for investment, I was skeptical, but you've proved that the Bennett name isn't all you have to offer." Tasha felt a lump form in her throat. "Thank you, Mr. Hawthorne. I firmly believe in the potential of this project." "And so do we," another investor interjected. "I think I speak for everyone when I say that we're interested in pursuing negotiations." The rest of the meeting passed in a blur of handshakes, card exchanges, and promises of future meetings. When she finally left the conference room, Tasha felt as if she could float. Her phone vibrated in her handbag. It was a message from David. "How did it go? No matter the result, I'm proud of you. Love you." Tasha smiled, feeling her heart expand with love and gratitude. She quickly typed a reply. "It was amazing. I'll tell you all about it at lunch. I love you too." As she walked to the elevator, Tasha couldn't help but think of her mother. What would Margaret say if she knew that her daughter had just secured a significant investment on her own? Part of her wanted to call the Bennett mansion, share the news, seek the approval she had always craved. But another part, a part that was growing stronger every day, knew she didn't need that anymore. She had David, she had her job, she had her integrity. And that, Tasha discovered, was more than enough. The elevator arrived with a soft ding, and Tasha stepped inside, ready to face whatever the future held. The price of freedom might be high, but the reward was priceless. Autumn in Chicago painted the city in shades of gold and red, a vibrant contrast to the gray of the skyscrapers. Tasha watched the leaves falling in the small park in front of her office, lost in thought. 3 years had passed since that fateful night at the Ritz-Carlton, 3 years since she had chosen love over society's expectations. The last few years hadn't been easy. Building a career from scratch, without the Bennett's financial support and connections, had proved a monumental challenge. But Tasha discovered in herself a resilience she didn't know she possessed. Her digital marketing consultancy company was finally taking off, gaining recognition in its own right. The phone on her desk rang, interrupting her daydreams. Tasha answered distractedly, hoping to hear her assistant's voice. "Ms. Bennett?" A vaguely familiar male voice sounded on the other end of the line. Tasha frowned. It had been years since anyone had called her Miss Bennett. "Actually, it's Mrs. Johnson now. Who am I speaking to?" There was a pause on the other end. "This is Dr. Reeves. I'm your mother's personal physician." Tasha felt her heart skip a beat. "Dr. Reeves? Has something happened to my mother?" The doctor sniffled, uncomfortable. "Mrs. Johnson, I'm sorry to inform you, but your mother suffered a stroke 2 days ago. She's stable now, but..." The doctor's voice became a distant hum as Tasha tried to process the information. Her mother, Margaret Bennett, the woman who had always seemed invincible, was in hospital. Despite all the years of estrangement, all the harsh words exchanged, Tasha felt a wave of worry wash over her. "She asked for you, Doctor." Reeves's words finally penetrated Tasha's haze of shock. What?" Tasha stammered, unable to believe what she was hearing. "Your mother asked for you, Mrs. Johnson," the doctor repeated gently. "She expressed a desire to see you." Tasha closed her eyes, feeling a confusing mix of emotions, worry, fear, a twinge of hope that she didn't want to admit. I need to think. Thank you for letting me know, Dr. Reeves." After hanging up, Tasha remained motionless for long minutes, staring sightlessly at the cityscape beyond her window. Her mind was a whirlwind of conflicting memories and emotions. The soft sound of a notification on her cell phone brought her back to reality. It was a message from David. "Hey love, just checking if we're still going out for dinner tonight, love you." Tasha felt a wave of gratitude for her husband. David, always so attentive, always her safe haven in the midst of life's storms. She quickly replied, "Something's happened. I'll tell you at home. I love you too." The rest of the day passed in a blur. Tasha tried to concentrate on her work, but her mind kept going back to her mother, lying in a hospital bed. When she finally got home, she found David in the kitchen preparing dinner. "Hey, you," he smiled, but his expression soon turned worried when he saw Tasha's tense face. "What's wrong?" Tasha collapsed into a chair, feeling the weight of the day finally hit her. "My mother's in hospital. She had a stroke." David immediately dropped what he was doing and knelt beside her, taking her hands in his. "Oh, Tasha, I'm so sorry. How is she?" "Stable, apparently," Tasha replied, her voice shaking. "But, David, she asked for me. She wants to see me." David was silent for a moment, processing the information. He, more than anyone, knew how much breaking up with his family had hurt Tasha. "And what do you want to do?" he asked softly. Tasha shook her head, feeling tears forming in her eyes. "I don't know. Part of me wants to run to the hospital right now, but another part... David, she disowned me. She said such cruel things. How can I just forget all this?" David pulled her into an embrace, letting her cry on his shoulder. "You don't have to forget, love, but maybe it's time to forgive." Tasha pulled away, looking at him with watery eyes. "Forgive? After everything she's done?" David nodded slowly. "Tasha, forgiveness isn't about forgetting the past or pretending we haven't been hurt. It's about freeing ourselves from the weight of anger and resentment. It's about choosing peace over bitterness." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Also, think about it. Your mother is ill, vulnerable. The fact that she asked to see you, doesn't that mean anything to you?" Tasha remained silent, letting David's words sink in. She thought of her mother, always so strong and imposing, now frail in a hospital bed. She thought of the years lost, the words not spoken, the hugs not given. "What if it's too late?" she whispered, giving voice to her greatest fear. David squeezed her hand gently. "It's never too late for forgiveness, Tasha. It's never too late for love." That night, lying in bed next to David, Tasha made her decision. The next morning, she would go to the hospital. She didn't know what to expect, whether there would be reconciliation or more hurt. But she knew she had to try. The hospital was a maze of sterile white corridors, the air heavy with the smell of antiseptic. Tasha felt her heart racing as she approached her mother's room. She stopped at the door, taking a deep breath to calm herself. When she entered, the sight almost made her recoil. Margaret Bennett, once the embodiment of elegance and strength, looked small and frail in the hospital bed. Tubes and machines surrounded her, constant beeping marking the rhythm of her life. Margaret's eyes opened slowly as she heard Tasha's footsteps. For a moment, mother and daughter looked at each other in silence, years of hurt and regret hanging between them. "Tasha," Margaret finally spoke, her voice hoarse and weak. "You came." Tasha felt tears burn her eyes. "Yes, Mom, I came." Margaret held out a trembling hand, and Tasha hesitated only for a second before taking it. The touch was fragile, but charged with emotion. "Forgive me," Margaret whispered, tears running down her wrinkled cheeks. "Please forgive me." And at that moment, looking into her mother's pleading eyes, Tasha felt something inside her break and pull itself together. Years of anger and hurt dissolved, leaving only a deep sadness for lost time and a burning desire to heal the wounds of the past. "Oh, Mom," Tasha sobbed, leaning down to hug Margaret carefully. "I forgive you. And you forgive me?" Margaret nodded against Tasha's shoulder, words failing her in the emotion of the moment. Mother and daughter stayed like that for a long time, crying together, beginning the painful but necessary healing process. When they finally parted, Margaret looked at Tasha with a mixture of regret and pride. "I was so foolish, Tasha, so blind. I heard about your company. You've built something incredible, all on your own." Tasha smiled through her tears. Thank you, Mom. That means a lot to me. And David? Margaret asked hesitantly. Are you still... Yes, Tasha replied, a note of happiness in her voice. We're very happy. He's wonderful, Mum. I wish you could really get to know him. Margaret nodded slowly. I'd like that. If you let me. At that moment, Tasha saw her mother not as the imposing Bennett matriarch, not as the figure who had hurt her so deeply, but as a fallible woman, capable of mistakes and regret. And with that vision came a deeper understanding of the power of forgiveness. Of course, Mom, Tasha said softly. Let's take it one step at a time, okay? When Tasha left the hospital hours later, she felt exhausted but strangely light. The road ahead would still be long, and there would undoubtedly be difficult moments. Years of hurt and misunderstanding couldn't be erased in a single day. But there, under the fall sky of Chicago, Tasha felt something she hadn't felt for a long time. Hope. Hope that the wounds of the past could heal, that family ties could be rekindled, that love could finally triumph over pride and prejudice. As she walked back home into David's loving arms, Tasha understood a profound truth. Forgiveness was not just a gift she was giving her mother, but a gift she was giving herself. It was the key to her own liberation, to her own peace. And with this realization, Tasha took the first step towards a future where love, understanding, and forgiveness had a prominent place. A future that, for the first time in years, included her mother. Spring arrived in Chicago with an explosion of color and new life. The trees along the magnificent mile were laden with flowers, and the air had that fresh, full of possibilities quality that only spring can bring. For Tasha Johnson, this sense of renewal resonated deeply. In the months since her reconciliation with her mother, Tasha had felt like she was living in two worlds. On the one hand, there was her life with David, cozy, full of love and laughter, built on the solid foundation of mutual understanding and unconditional support. On the other, there was the slow and sometimes painful process of rebuilding her relationship with Margaret. Hospital visits had turned into weekly lunches, where mother and daughter carefully navigated the turbulent waters of their shared past. There were moments of tension, of course, old habits and resentments that sometimes threatened to resurface. But there were also moments of genuine connection, of shared laughter and newfound understanding. On this sunny Saturday morning, Tasha found herself in her favorite antique store in the Wicker Park neighborhood. It was a cozy place, full of hidden treasures and memories from other lives. Tasha loved to spend a few hours here at weekends, looking for unique pieces to decorate the apartment she shared with David. She was examining a delicate porcelain teacup when she heard a familiar voice behind her. Tasha? Tasha Bennett, is that you? Tasha turned around in surprise and found herself face to face with a face she hadn't seen for years. Ethan Caldwell. Ethan smiled, his blue eyes sparkling with the same charm Tasha remembered from her youth. I can't believe it. How long has it been? 10 years? At least, Tasha replied, feeling a strange mixture of nostalgia and discomfort. Ethan Caldwell had been her best friend growing up and her first love as a teenager. He had also been Margaret's preferred choice for a son-in-law before Tasha met David. You look great, Ethan said, his eyes roaming over Tasha in a way that made her feel slightly uncomfortable. What have you been up to? I heard rumors that you'd left town. Tasha laughed softly. The rumors of my departure were greatly exaggerated. In fact, I have my own marketing consulting company right here in Chicago. Ethan's eyes widened with genuine admiration. Wow, that's amazing, Tash. I always knew you'd do something great. There was an uncomfortable pause, years of unspoken history hanging between them. Finally, Ethan spoke again, his voice softer. Listen, I know things have been complicated between us in the past, but it would be great to catch up. How about a coffee? Tasha hesitated. On the one hand, she and Ethan had a complicated history. On the other, she was curious to know what had happened to her old friend over the last few years. Besides, now that she was reconnecting with her past through her mother, maybe it was time to make peace with other parts of her old life too. Of course, she finally replied. Why not? Half an hour later, they were sitting at a corner table in a charming cafe nearby. Ethan ordered a strong black coffee, just the way Tasha remembered he liked it. She opted for a chai latte, a preference she had developed over the last few years with David. "So," Ethan began, leaning forward with interest, "tell me all about it. How did you go from Bennett heiress to successful entrepreneur?" Tasha smiled, taking a sip of her chai. "It's a long story. The short version is, I fell in love, followed my heart, and discovered that there was more to me than just the Bennett name." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You fell in love? Now I'm intrigued. Who's the lucky guy who stole the heart of the indomitable Tasha Bennett?" "Johnson, actually," Tasha corrected gently. "Tasha Johnson now. My husband's name is David. He's a musician." Something flashed in Ethan's eyes. Surprise? Disappointment? But it was quickly replaced by a polite smile. "A musician? Wow, that must have been quite a shock for Margaret." Tasha laughed humorlessly. "You have no idea. But things are better now. We're working on it." Ethan nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. "And you? Are you happy?" The question took Tasha by surprise, not by its content, but by the intensity in Ethan's eyes when he asked it. "Yes," she answered honestly. "Very happy." There was a moment of silence, charged with something Tasha couldn't name. Then Ethan smiled, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm happy for you, Tash. I really am." The conversation flowed more easily after that. Ethan talked about his career in corporate law, his years in New York, his recent return to Chicago. Tasha shared stories about building her company, the difficulties and triumphs along the way. It was only when Ethan casually mentioned that he was single that Tasha felt that twinge of unease again. There was something about the way he looked at her, something about the way his hands occasionally brushed hers on the table, that made her feel uneasy. "You know," Ethan said, his voice low and intimate, "I've always wondered what it would have been like if things had been different between us." Tasha felt her heart racing, but not in the way it used to when she was younger. Now it was more a feeling of alarm, of boundaries being tested. "Ethan, no, listen to me," he insisted, leaning closer. "We were good together, Tash. We had everything: history, chemistry, the support of our families. Sometimes I think, did we make a mistake by letting that slip away?" Tasha pulled away slightly, feeling suddenly uncomfortable. "Ethan, I'm married, happily married." Ethan smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I know. I'm not suggesting anything inappropriate, just thinking out loud, I suppose." But there was something in his eyes, an intensity that made Tasha feel uncomfortable. She looked at her watch, feigning surprise. "Oh, look at the time. I have to go. I promised David we'd meet for lunch." Ethan looked disappointed but nodded. Of course, it was great to see you, Tash. We should do it again sometime." Tasha smiled politely, but made no promises. As she left the cafe, she felt a confusing mix of emotions, nostalgia for the past, gratitude for the present, and a hint of something she didn't want to examine too closely. The drive home was a journey through memories. Every corner seemed to contain a fragment of her former life. The park where she and Ethan used to play as children, the school where they had their first awkward teenage kiss, the restaurant where he took her on their first official date. But as she approached her apartment, the memories of the past were gradually replaced by the reality of the present. She thought of David, of his warm smile and his unconditional love. She thought of the life they had built together, the struggles and triumphs they had shared. When she finally got home, she found David in the kitchen, preparing lunch. The smell of garlic and fresh herbs filled the air, and the sight of her husband humming softly as he cooked made Tasha's heart fill with love. "Hey you," David smiled when he saw her. "How was your morning of treasure hunting?" Tasha hesitated for a moment. Part of her wanted to tell David about meeting Ethan, to share the strange mixture of emotions that the reunion had aroused. But another part, a part she wasn't entirely comfortable examining, wanted to keep that encounter to herself. "It was interesting," she finally replied, forcing a smile. "I'll tell you about it later." "What are you cooking?" "It smells wonderful." As David began to talk excitedly about the new dish he was trying out, Tasha felt a twinge of guilt. There was nothing to feel guilty about, she told herself. She hadn't done anything wrong. It was just a coffee with an old friend. But as she watched David moving around the kitchen, so at ease in their shared space, Tasha couldn't help but think of Ethan, of his words, of the look in his eyes. And for a brief moment, she wondered, what if? What if she had chosen the safe path, the expected path? What if she had stayed with Ethan, kept her place in Chicago high society, never defied her family's expectations? But then David turned around, smiling at her with such love and confidence that it made her heart ache. And Tasha knew. She knew with a certainty that surprised her with its intensity. It didn't matter about the what-ifs. It didn't matter about the past or the roads not taken. This was where she belonged. Here, with David, was where she belonged. Still, as she joined David in the kitchen, helping him finish lunch, Tasha couldn't help but feel a slight unease. Ethan's reappearance had stirred something inside her, brought to the surface issues and emotions that she thought she had left behind a long time ago. And while she laughed at David's joke, savoring the familiarity and comfort of their shared routine, a small part of her wondered what the future might bring, whether the past really was in the past, or whether there were more surprises and more choices waiting on the horizon. Summer arrived in Chicago with a relentless heat wave, turning the city streets into an urban oven. Tasha walked hurriedly down the air-conditioned corridor of the hospital, her heart beating at a rapid pace that had nothing to do with the heat outside. Over the last few weeks, since her unexpected encounter with Ethan, Tasha had found herself in an emotional turmoil. Memories of the past mixed with the reality of the present, creating a tangled web of feelings that she struggled to untangle. Her guilt at not having told David about her meeting with Ethan only increased with each passing day. But today all these worries were momentarily put aside. Margaret had called earlier, her voice shaky on the phone, asking Tasha to come to the hospital. "We need to talk," she had said, and something in the tone of her voice made Tasha drop everything and run. When she reached the door to Margaret's room, Tasha paused, taking a deep breath to calm herself. When she entered, she found her mother sitting on the bed, looking frail, but with a determined glint in her eyes that Tasha knew well. "Mum?" Tasha called softly, approaching the bed. "Is everything all right?" Margaret looked at her daughter, a tired but genuine smile on her lips. "Tasha, darling, thank you for coming so quickly." Tasha sat down in the chair next to the bed, taking her mother's hand. "Of course, Mum. What happened? You scared me on the phone." Margaret was silent for a moment, as if gathering her courage. When she finally spoke, her voice was full of emotion. "Tasha, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago." Tasha felt her heart racing. "What is it, Mum?" Margaret took a deep breath. "It's about your father, and about me, about why I reacted so badly when you chose David." Tasha sat still, hardly daring to breathe. In all the years of her life, her mother had rarely spoken about her father, who had died when Tasha was still very young. "Your father," Margaret began, her voice trembling, "wasn't the first man I loved. Before him, there was another. A man called Michael." Tasha watched, fascinated, as her mother dug up memories long buried. "Michael was different. He was a musician, like your David. He played jazz in clubs around the city. I met him during my first year at college and, well, it was like the world exploded into color." Margaret smiled, lost in memories. "He was everything my parents disapproved of. Black, poor, with no connections in high society. But I didn't care. I loved him with all the intensity and madness of youth." Tasha felt her throat tighten. She had never seen her mother like this, so open, so vulnerable. "What happened?" she asked softly. Margaret's smile disappeared, replaced by an expression of deep sadness. "Reality happened. The pressure from my family, the weight of social expectations. I wasn't strong enough, Tasha. I chose the safe path. I left Michael and married his father." Silent tears streamed down Margaret's face now. Your father was a good man, Tasha. He loved me and I learned to love him too. But there was always a part of me that wondered, what if? And when you showed up with David, well, it was like seeing my own history repeating itself, and I was terrified. Tasha felt her own tears start to fall. Oh, Mom. Margaret squeezed Tasha's hand. I was wrong, darling. So wrong. I projected my own fears and regrets onto you. I wanted to protect you from the pain I felt, but in the process, I almost destroyed our relationship. She paused, wiping away the tears with her free hand. But you, Tasha, you were stronger than I've ever been. You chose love, despite everything. And look at you now. Strong, independent, happy. You made the choice I never had the courage to make. Tasha was speechless, overwhelmed by her mother's revelation. Years of misunderstanding and resentment began to dissipate in the light of this new understanding. Mom, I don't know what to say. Margaret smiled sadly. There's nothing to say, dear. I just wanted you to know, to understand why I acted the way I did. It's not an excuse, but it's an explanation, Tasha added softly. Margaret nodded. Exactly. There was a moment of silence between them, a silence full of newfound understanding and mutual forgiveness. Then Margaret leaned over, picking something up from the bedside table. It was a weathered envelope. This, she said, handing the envelope to Tasha, is a letter I wrote to my mother at the time. Explaining why I wanted to stay with Michael, I never had the courage to deliver it. Tasha took the envelope with trembling hands. Do you want me to read it? Margaret nodded. If you want, I think it might help you understand, well, everything. Carefully, Tasha opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. Her mother's handwriting, younger and bolder than Tasha had ever seen, covered the page. Dear Mom, I know you won't understand, but I have to try to explain. Michael is not just a musician to me. He's the melody that makes my heart sing, the rhythm that gives my life meaning. I know that you and Dad have expectations of me. I know there's a path mapped out, a future planned. But Mom, that future has no color, no music. It's a symphony in black and white, when Michael showed me that life can be vibrant, unpredictable jazz. I love you, Mom, with every fiber of my being. And I know that this will disappoint you and Dad. I know that society will talk, that there will be consequences, but for the first time in my life, I feel like I'm being true to myself. Please try to understand. Try to see beyond the color of his skin, beyond his lack of social status. See the man who makes your daughter smile like never before. See the future full of possibilities that opens up before us. I hope that one day you can accept my choice, that you can see that true love knows no barriers of race or class. May you understand that sometimes we need to follow our hearts, even when the path is difficult. With love. Margaret. Tasha finished reading, tears streaming freely down her face. She looked at her mother and saw the same river of emotion in her eyes. Oh, Mom, Tasha whispered, unable to say more. Margaret smiled through her tears. I never sent that letter. I never had the courage, but I've kept it all these years as a reminder of what could have been. And when you brought David home, well, all those feelings, all those fears came to the surface again. Tasha leaned in, hugging her mother gently but tightly. Thank you for sharing this with me, Mom. I understand now. I really do. When they separated, Margaret held Tasha's face between her hands. You're stronger than I've ever been, Tasha. You made the right choice. Never doubt that. Tasha nodded, feeling a weight she didn't even know she was carrying dissipate. And Michael, she asked softly, do you know what happened to him? Margaret shook her head. No. After we broke up, I never saw him again. Sometimes when I hear jazz on the radio, I wonder... She left the sentence hanging in the air and Tasha understood. Some questions would never be answered. The two were silent for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. Then Margaret spoke again, her voice stronger. Tasha, I want you to promise me something. What, Mom? Promise me that you will never let fear or other people's expectations dictate your choices. Promise that you will always follow your heart. Tasha felt a lump in her throat as she thought of Ethan, of her own recent indecision. I promise, Mum. Margaret smiled, looking more at peace than Tasha had ever seen her. Good. Now, tell me more about this David of yours. I think it's time I really got to know him, don't you? Tasha laughed, feeling light-hearted for the first time in weeks. Of course, Mom, you'll love him, I'm sure. As she began to talk about David, about his music, his kindness, his love, Tasha felt something change inside her. The restlessness that had plagued her since meeting Ethan began to dissipate. She finally understood that what she had with David wasn't just love. It was a choice, a brave choice, like the one her mother never had the chance to make. And at that moment, sitting beside her mother's hospital bed, Tasha knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right choice. When she left the hospital hours later, the summer sun was still beating down on the city. But for Tasha, the world seemed brighter, more full of possibilities. She picked up her phone, dialing a familiar number. Hey, love, David's warm voice sounded on the other end. How did it go with your mum? Tasha smiled, feeling her heart fill with love. It was revealing. I'll tell you all about it when I get home. Hey, how about going out for dinner tonight? I have something important to tell you. As she walked towards the subway, Tasha felt a new determination. It was time to be completely honest with David, to share her recent doubts and fears. It was time to reaffirm her choice, her commitment, because now she understood better than ever the value of choosing love, the value of being true to herself, no matter what the consequences. And with this understanding came a peace she hadn't felt for a long time. The future, with all its uncertainties and challenges, no longer seemed so daunting, because Tasha knew that as long as she had the courage to follow her heart, she would find her way. Autumn arrived in Chicago with an explosion of vibrant colors, transforming the city's parks into a tapestry of reds, oranges, and golds. For Tasha Johnson, this change of season seemed to reflect the transformations in her own life. In the weeks following the revealing conversation with her mother, Tasha felt as if she was emerging from a long emotional winter. Her honest conversation with David about meeting Ethan and her momentary doubts had strengthened their relationship even more. David, with his unwavering understanding and love, had listened, supported her, and reaffirmed his commitment to her. However, there was still one final piece of the puzzle that Tasha needed to fit together. One last conversation with her mother, Margaret. On this cool sunny Saturday morning, Tasha once again found herself in the hospital corridor, on her way to Margaret's room. This time, however, there was no anxiety in her step, just a calm determination. As she entered the room, Tasha was greeted by the sight of her mother sitting on the bed, leafing through a magazine. Margaret looked stronger than on her last few visits, a healthy glow on her cheeks. "Good morning, Mum," Tasha said softly, closing the door behind her. Margaret looked up, a genuine smile lighting her face. "Tasha, darling, how nice to see you." Tasha approached, placing a kiss on her mother's cheek before sitting down in the chair next to the bed. For a moment, they sat in silence, each watching the other, feeling the weight of what was to come. Finally, Tasha spoke. "Mum, we need to talk. Really talk." Margaret nodded slowly, putting the magazine aside. "Yes, I think we do." "About what, exactly?" Tasha took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "About everything. About the past, the present, about us." Margaret settled down on the bed, her posture becoming more upright, more reminiscent of the matriarch she used to be. "Very well, where do you want to start?" "The beginning, I guess," Tasha replied. "Mum, I understand now why you reacted the way you did when I introduced David. I understand the pain and regret you were carrying, but that doesn't justify the way you treated me, the way you treated David." Margaret lowered her eyes, the guilt evident in her expression. "I know, Tasha, and there isn't a day when I don't regret it." "I believe you," Tasha continued, her voice gentle but firm. But understanding isn't the same as forgetting or forgiving completely. Margaret looked at Tasha, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I know, dear, and I don't expect you to forget or forgive easily. I just hope we can rebuild somehow. Tasha nodded, feeling her own throat tighten with emotion. That's what I want too, Mum. But for that, we need to be completely honest with each other. No more secrets. No more manipulation. I agree, Margaret said, her voice trembling. Where do you want to start? Tasha took a deep breath. I want you to tell me exactly what you felt when I introduced David. Not what you said then, not what you think I want to hear now. The truth, however painful it may be. Margaret was silent for a long moment, her eyes fixed on her hands clasped in her lap. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, almost a whisper. When I saw you with David, my first thought was panic, not because of him specifically, but because of what he represented. I saw my daughter about to make the same mistake I almost made. I saw you falling in love with someone that society, our society, wouldn't approve of. She paused, wiping away a tear that had escaped. My second thought was envy. Envy of your courage, of your willingness to follow your heart in a way that I was never able to. And then came shame. Shame at my own prejudices, at my past cowardice. Tasha listened in silence, feeling a mixture of pain and understanding. Margaret continued, her voice gaining strength. But instead of facing those feelings, instead of supporting you and admiring your courage, I reacted with anger and disapproval. I projected all my fears and regrets onto you, Tasha, and in the process I almost lost my daughter. Tears were flowing freely down Margaret's face now. I'm so sorry, Tasha, I really am. There's no excuse for the way I acted, for the things I said. I was wrong, so terribly wrong. Tasha felt her own tears start to fall. She reached out, taking her mother's hand. Oh, Mom. No, Margaret said, squeezing Tasha's hand. Let me finish. You deserve to hear all this. Tasha nodded silently. You're stronger than I've ever been, Tasha. Braver. You made the choice I never had the courage to make. And look at you now. Strong, independent, happy. You proved you were right, and I was wrong. Margaret paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. I love you, Tasha, more than you can imagine, and I'm so proud of the woman you've become, not in spite of your choices, but because of them. Tasha sobbed, unable to contain her emotion. I love you too, Mom, and I forgive you. The two women hugged, years of hurt and misunderstanding dissolving into shared tears. When they finally separated, Margaret held Tasha's face between her hands, looking into her eyes. Thank you, dear, for your forgiveness, for your understanding. I know I don't deserve it, but I promise I'll do my best to be worthy of it. Tasha smiled through her tears. I know you will, Mom. There was a moment of comfortable silence between them, a silence filled with new understanding and renewed love. Then Margaret spoke again, her voice lighter. Now tell me more about this David of yours. I think it's time I really got to know him, don't you? Tasha laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. Of course, Mom. Actually, I was thinking, what do you say we all have dinner together next week? You, me, and David? Margaret's eyes lit up. I'd love that, dear. As Tasha began to talk about David, about his music, his kindness, his love, she felt something change inside her. The last shadow of doubt, the last trace of unease, dissipated completely. Hours later, when Tasha finally left the hospital, the autumn sun was low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. She paused for a moment, taking a deep breath of the fresh afternoon air. She picked up her phone, dialing David's number. Hey, love, David's warm voice sounded on the other end. How did it go with your mom? Tasha smiled, feeling her heart fill with love and gratitude. It was transformative. I'll tell you all about it when I get home. Oh, and get ready. We're having dinner with my mum next week. She could hear the smile in David's voice when he replied, "I can't wait." As she walked towards the subway, Tasha felt a peace she hadn't felt for years. The future stretched out before her, full of possibilities. There would be challenges, of course. Rebuilding her relationship with her mother would take time and effort. Integrating her two lives, the new one she had built with David and the old one with her family, would not be easy. But for the first time in a long time, Tasha wasn't afraid. She had love, David's love, her mother's renewed love, and most importantly, her own love. And with that love, she knew she could face anything. Autumn in Chicago continued its colorful dance, the leaves falling softly around Tasha as she walked, and just as the trees were preparing for a new cycle of life, Tasha also felt ready for a new chapter, a chapter of reconciliation, of growth, of love, a chapter she couldn't wait to begin. Winter in Chicago arrived with its usual ferocity, covering the city in a blanket of snow and turning the streets into a maze of ice and twinkling lights. For Tasha Johnson, however, the cold outside contrasted sharply with the warmth she felt in her heart. The last few months since the revealing conversation with her mother had been an emotional roller coaster. The planned dinner with Margaret and David had been a surprising success, with her mother making a genuine effort to get to know and accept the man her daughter loved. David, for his part, had charmed Margaret with his kindness and intelligence, proving that he was much more than just a musician. Now on a cold December evening, Tasha stood in front of her closet, contemplating what to wear for her mother's birthday. It was the first time in years that she would be attending an event at the Bennett mansion, and the anxiety she felt was a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "You'll look beautiful in whatever you choose," David's warm voice sounded behind her. Tasha turned, smiling at her husband. David looked impressive in his dark suit, his hair carefully groomed. "You don't look too bad yourself," she joked, adjusting her tie. David took her hands, his gaze becoming serious. "Are you sure about this, Tash? I know that going back to the Bennett mansion isn't easy for you." Tasha nodded, feeling a wave of gratitude for David's constant support. "I'm sure. It's time to close this loop, to really integrate our lives." Half an hour later, they were on their way to the Bennett mansion. As the car snaked through the familiar streets of their old neighborhood, Tasha felt a strange mixture of nostalgia and detachment. This world, which had once been all she knew, now seemed so far away. When they arrived at the mansion, they were greeted by a sea of familiar faces. Old family friends, childhood classmates, prominent figures from Chicago high society. Tasha felt the curious stares, heard the barely disguised whispers. She was once again the center of attention, but this time with David firmly at her side, she felt invincible. Margaret greeted them at the entrance to the ballroom, radiant in a navy blue dress that highlighted her eyes. "Tasha, David, how nice of you to come," she smiled, hugging them warmly. As the evening progressed, Tasha found herself navigating with surprising ease between her two worlds. She introduced David to old acquaintances, chatted with former neighbors, and even danced a waltz with her husband, much to the delight of the guests. It was during a moment's pause, while David was chatting animatedly with a group of musicians hired for the event, that Tasha noticed a familiar figure across the hall. Ethan. Her heart leapt involuntarily at the sight of him. Ethan looked as dapper as she remembered, his charming smile lighting up his face as he chatted with a group of guests. For a moment their gazes met, and Tasha saw a glimmer of something. Regret. Desire. In his eyes. Before she could fully process what she was feeling, Tasha heard her mother's voice calling for everyone's attention. "Dear friends," Margaret began, her voice clear and strong, "thank you all for coming to celebrate my birthday. But today I don't want to talk about me. I want to talk about love, about courage, and about second chances." Tasha felt her heart race as her mother continued. "Many of you know my daughter, Tasha," Margaret said, gesturing towards her. "And many of you have probably heard the rumors, the gossip about her life choices. Well, today I want to say something about that." There was a murmur of anticipation in the crowd. Tasha felt David approach, placing a comforting hand on her back. My daughter, Margaret continued, her voice laced with emotion, is the bravest person I know. She had the courage to follow her heart, to choose love over social expectations, and I couldn't be prouder of her. Tasha felt tears forming in her eyes. Beside her, David squeezed her hand gently. Tasha and David, Margaret said, looking directly at them. You have taught me the true meaning of love, a love that transcends barriers, that defies convention, and for that I am eternally grateful. There was a moment of stunned silence, followed by a wave of applause. Tasha saw smiling faces all around her, some surprised, others moved. She saw Ethan across the hall, an indecipherable expression on his face. Margaret raised her glass. So, I ask you all to join me in a toast to Tasha and David and to the transformative power of true love. The crowd raised their glasses, echoing the toast. Tasha felt overwhelmed, tears of joy streaming down her cheeks. She looked at David, seeing the same love and emotion reflected in his eyes. Later, as the party continued around her, Tasha found herself alone for a moment, watching the guests from the balcony. She heard footsteps behind her and turned, finding Ethan. Hi, Tash, he said softly. Hi, Ethan, she replied, feeling strangely calm. There was a moment of silence between them, years of unspoken history hanging in the air. You look happy, Ethan finally said. Tasha smiled, a genuine, radiant smile. I am, Ethan, truly happy. Ethan nodded slowly. I'm happy for you, Tash. I really am. He paused, as if gathering his courage. You know, for a while, I wondered, what if? What if we'd stayed together? What if you'd chosen the path that everyone expected? Tasha felt her heart squeeze, not from desire or regret, but from a deep understanding. I know, Ethan. I wondered too for a brief moment. Ethan smiled sadly. But seeing you now, seeing you with David, I understand. You made the right choice, Tash. Tasha reached out, gently touching Ethan's arm. Thank you, Ethan. That means a lot to me. At that moment, David appeared on the balcony. Hey, love, your mom's looking for you. Ethan stepped back, nodding respectfully to David. Take good care of her, he said, before returning to the party. David looked curiously at Tasha. Is everything all right? Tasha smiled, pulling David close. Everything's perfect, she said, kissing him softly. As they walked back to the party, hand in hand, Tasha felt a sense of completeness that she had never experienced before. She looked around the hall. She saw her mother laughing with a group of friends. She saw David chatting animatedly with some of the musicians. She saw familiar faces from her past mixed with the new people she had brought into her life. And in that moment, Tasha understood. She understood that life wasn't about choosing between two worlds, but about creating her own world. A world where love overcame prejudice, where courage triumphed over expectations, where past and present merged to create a bright future. Later that evening, when all the guests had left and only the family remained, Margaret called Tasha for a moment alone. Darling, she said, holding Tasha's hands, there's something I want to give you. Margaret took a small velvet box from her pocket and handed it to Tasha. Inside, Tasha found a delicate sapphire brooch. This brooch, Margaret explained, her voice soft, belonged to my grandmother. She gave it to my mother, who gave it to me. It's a family tradition to pass it on to the next generation when they find true love. Tasha felt tears forming in her eyes. Oh, Mum. Margaret smiled, tears shining in her own eyes. I should have given it to you years ago, Tasha, but I'm giving it to you now, with all my love and blessing. Mother and daughter embraced, years of misunderstanding and hurt finally giving way to renewed love and deeper understanding. When Tasha and David finally left the Bennett mansion in the early hours of the morning, the snow was falling softly around them. Tasha stopped for a moment, looking at the house that had once been her home. What are you thinking about? David asked softly. Tasha smiled, entwining her fingers with David's. I'm thinking about choices, about paths not taken and paths created. I'm thinking about how grateful I am to have chosen you. to have chosen us. David pulled her close, kissing her softly. I'm grateful too, Tash. Every day. As they walked towards the car, the snow falling silently around them, Tasha felt a deep peace. She had made her choice years ago when she decided to follow her heart and stay with David. But now, she was choosing again. Choosing love, family, authenticity. Choosing the life she had built, with all its complexities and joys. And as the car pulled away from the Bennett mansion, Tasha looked at David, at the man who had changed her life in so many ways. She knew, with a certainty that came from the depths of her soul, that she would make that same choice 1,000 times over. Because in the end, Tasha's choice wasn't just about David, or about her family, or about social expectations. It was about being true to herself, about having the courage to live authentically. And that, Tasha knew, was the most important choice of all. The car snaked through the snowy streets of Chicago, taking them back home, to the future they had chosen, together. A future full of possibilities, love, and the promise of many more brave choices to come. And Tasha, with a full heart and a smile on her lips, couldn't wait to see what that future would bring. If this story touched your heart, then don't forget to leave a like. Use the super thanks located just below the video to directly support the channel and help create more amazing content. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any updates. Now don't miss the next incredible story that's appearing on your screen. I greatly appreciate your support and hope to see you soon. Thank you for watching.